So we have a new report from the Economic and Social Affairs Department of the United Nations, which says multiple global crises is likely to lead to a period of prolonged low growth, with 2023 growth revised lower to 2.3%. In the meantime, Nigeria is tiptoeing towards May 29 inauguration of a new administration. However, the outgoing government of President Muhammadu Buhari is yet busy is approving new contracts and signing new economic deals and partnerships. My guest on this, all of this is Bongo. He's a professor of economics at the Lagos Business School. We thank you for connecting into the show tonight. Good evening. Welcome.
Good evening, Bosin.
Great to see you, Professor. Let's start from this United Nations Department of Economic Affairs and Development as far as a new report is concerned. Do you agree with the UN that the global growth is at the risk of a prolonged downside?
Yeah, I mean, no one can dispute that. Even the IMF in their latest African regional outlook also said something similar. And the reason, is not hard to find, because you've seen that interest rates are rising higher and then for longer. That's the prediction. And then we know that there is always this negative, relationship between interest rate and investment. When interest rate is high, as it is right now, that is a huge disincentive for investments of whatever kind. So it's, getting funds for any sort of economic project right now is becoming very expensive and very difficult. In fact, since the spring, April of 2022, no African country has managed to raise funds from the Eurobond market. So that tells you, the state of affairs there. So there's this funding squeeze that even the IMF speaks about. So yes, because of the rising interest rate, we definitely will have low investment. And then when you have low investment, you are certainly going to have very low growth. Don't forget, this is almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you followed Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, there is some observation he made in that book based on his research of almost 2 centuries of, more than 3 centuries of data, which shows that whenever you have this divergence between interest rates and the growth rate of the economy, then you're going to have a prolonged, divergence when it comes to growth outcomes. So, and that's exactly the situation we have on ground presently. So we have very high interest rates, which has really swamped growth rate of economies. So, last year there was this statistic, I don't know if you saw it, that the global output, that's GDP, global GDP, valued at about $105 trillion. But then global debt has risen to more than 300 trillion. So that is a global debt to GDP ratio of more than 300%. So the world is really, swimming in debt as it is now. Of course, people ask who is owing who. But anyway, that's the situation.
Everyone is owing his neighbor, by the way. China is holding U.S. debts. Everybody's owing someone somewhere. So we're all in debt, one way or the other. But again, it looks like crisis upon crisis, to use the phrase by Kristalina Georgieva of the IMF, has come to stay. So you've got a shortage of funding for developing countries, because I want us to start bringing this home, which has been identified as a very major challenge. What options do we have at raising both foreign and domestic capital? What options, what windows are open for us here in Sub-Saharan Africa?
I think the options are quite limited at the moment because, in Africa, we really depend on foreign capital. Whenever we have a gap, so, the logic of the financing gap. So we always have to run abroad to look for money. And then for many years, we've seen, very low and cheap money all over the world at very low interest rate. But then that has changed, and we've seen that interest rate trajectory has actually, taking an inflation point. So it's gone on the rise. So that means raising foreign monies is going to be difficult, very difficult, if not impossible, for most African countries that are already very high when it comes to their exposure. Debt, think of Ghana, think of Nigeria, think of other African countries. So that's going to be very difficult. So what options do we have? So we have to embark on, the much needed structural, reforms. One of them, it will be, you just mentioned that the president, even though he's about to go, is busy signing new contracts and new concessions. That is what people have been talking about all these years, that we need to begin to find ways to unlock private capital into the investment space. So that is one way to go. Then, of course, there are so many other things, especially in a country like Nigeria, where we have a lot of idle capital and assets that need to be somehow, brought into utilization. So this is where some creative thinking is required. I believe that the incoming administration, as I've also argued on this space in the past, face enormous challenge when it comes to growing the economy, because unlike in the past, there is scarcity of capital to deploy in order to address the critical issues. In fact, right now, we've seen that in most African countries, even Nigeria included, there is a struggle to find the finance for social infrastructure, whether it's health or education. So government is going to be hard pressed. So the alternative that we have is to find a way to unlock private financing, domestic financing, and of course international financing as well. But then it has to be, project tied. So we're talking about project financing. We're talking about public-private partnerships. So that seems to be the only option, left for us to make progress when it comes to growing the economy.
Yeah, Professor Adi, you just talked about the government, of course, just announced the concessioning or the PPP for 3 port projects, as well as 2 airports in the country. Do you think this is not enough, or you think we're just scratching the surface, as it were? Do you think we should go a whole more holistically when you look at other countries such as Angola, such as Egypt, who are talking about 40, 50, 60, 70 state-owned enterprises that they are onboarding massively into the private sector and taking cash and taking money in and allowing the private sector, and there's no discrimination whether they are local or foreign, as long as they behave themselves and keep to the letters they need to do on. So if we just concession 3 seaports in Nigeria and just 2 airports, do you think that's enough?
No, that's not enough. It's grossly insufficient. And actually, I think we are backing the wrong tree, if you ask me. Because, we in 2006, we concessioned about 26 ports in Nigeria. We had 25 concessions, 15 to 20-year tenure, and then we have 1 BOT, build, operate, transfer. Now, the data shows, the evidence actually shows that we didn't register much significant progress when it comes to cargo throughput in the ports. So the volume of cargo discharging those ports were not significantly, different in terms of a rise against the pre-concession period, before 2006, when you do that comparison. So that means we didn't quite achieve much when it comes to efficiency that we wanted to have in the port system. So we actually needed to look at the statistics, look at the data to know whether we're doing the right thing. So you can see that in order to ease the logistical constraints that we have in the economy, that just concessioning of ports isn't the way to go. And by the way, we already have some ports that are completely inactive as it is. So the ports in Tinkan and Apapa seem to be where the cargo, shipment is concentrated in Nigeria. The so-called eastern ports, the ports of Calabar, of Port Harcourt, and Warri are grossly underutilized. And then we have also some dry ports, and we haven't seen cargoes moving to those ports. So I don't think port is the major problem. And then we have these deep sea ports that are being done also here in Lekki, somewhere in Akwa Ibom State. And then I don't know the state of that of Akwa Ibom currently. And then we are now, the president is signing on some more concessions in the areas, regions that are already over-concentrated. So the ports are in Ondo State, in Lekki, and in Delta. So I don't see what we are going to achieve, because the real problem with cargo movement, with logistics in Nigeria as it is more political than structural as such. So we need to find those political impediments to the utilization of the eastern ports. We have to solve that, and it doesn't take new concessions. And by the way, currently the logistical problem in Nigeria is more of intermodality and lack of access, because we do not have the rail system. It has not been activated. So that should have been the priority. If the president has concession rail tracks, across the nation, I would have told you, yes, that is a step in the right direction. But awarding more contracts, more concessions in the port system doesn't seem to add anything. If the data is anything to go by.
Yes,
what we need here to solve the logistic constraint in Nigeria, which is an impediment to growth and development, is to improve the modality, both multimodality and intermodality. We don't have those. We don't have the track. We don't have these modes of transportation shaking hands, among themselves. And until that happens, the ease of doing business, the so-called ease of doing business, whether it is domestic or within the AFCTA, would continue to be just a mere paper tiger.
So, in a sense, you're saying we need to open up the economy, the local economy, a little bit more in terms of putting it in the hands of both local and overseas private investors. Do you see that happening under the incoming administration? How quickly do you think we need to go to get the private sector in? Of course, there is a funding gap globally, but there's still good money looking for good investment, as we can see in a number of sub-Saharan African countries, including North Africa, by the way, and the Middle East. So money is still out there, by the way, somewhere, but you've got to show where it's going to be best placed. So how much of this opening up would you want to see? Privatization, is it concessioning? In what sectors do you think we need to move very quickly? Perhaps within what is often described as the first 100 days, beyond the paperwork that we've done for years and years without seeing tangible results on the ground?
The challenge to infrastructure, whatever sector or infrastructure, the challenge that we have in Nigeria is not just about, finding the capital. Like you rightly pointed out, there are funds all over the world, but it's just about finding, as they say, the bankable project, a commercially viable project. That is what I think investors are always looking at. So the problem that we have with that is the sincerity on the part of government. So the incoming administration doesn't seem to have a lot of options left to it as it is. So I don't know, but it looks like everybody would still want to give Nigeria money, because even at as high as our international exposure is, debt that is building up to more than 50 trillion naira, where we can still raise money from the World Bank. So I don't know the limit, but I think we have gotten to that limit. It's not really economically wise any longer for us to continue on that track. So what I see the next administration doing, in fact, the only route to progress for them is to activate the private sector. So that means deregulation, privatization, as you mentioned, of the key sectors, open up the economy for private investment. But we have to be very sincere, and we have to approach it from a very rigorous and informed perspective, because there is something again about scaling up of PPPs. There's this argument that PPP is more about privatizing benefit and profit, whereas we socialize the cost. So we should be sure that there is, proper value for money, analysis, so that we are not just contracting services for the sake of it. I've also looked at what was said that the private sector or the concessionaire for the ports would, over the 50-year period, make $50 billion or thereabout. Then federal government will be making about 2.5 billion. Then the question is that sufficient, convincing value for money, argument, So these are some of the things that I think we need to be careful about. Otherwise, we may end up handing over the economy, to the private sector, and then the people will begin to suffer for it, except when there is clearly demonstrated value for money in the key sectors. Then we can go for that. Otherwise, perhaps government will need to find, some structural, interventions. The World Bank talks about blended finance, and I'm happy to know what InfraCredit is doing, so helping, investors to find the right capital, de-risking some of the investments in infrastructure space. So we need to, again, be very proactive on that route, trying to see how we can assemble the different vintages of capital, to form a very robust and sustainable blended finance that could help us to really achieve the objectives that we want when it comes to privatizing the economy, not just opening up, allowing the market for ESTEC, because it has its own drawbacks as well.
Bongo Adi, a professor of economics at the Lagos Business School. We thank you so much for your time tonight and your insight, and do have a very great weekend. Thank you.